Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Cremanda for YogaUOnline, and I'm here with Doug Keller. Doug is one of those people who really needs no introduction in the yoga community, but it's worth celebrating his significant contributions to the field nonetheless. So I'm going to do that. Known for his mastery of yoga alignment, particularly as it applies to structural health of the body, Doug is also a scholar with a vast knowledge about yoga philosophy and a really deep understanding of the deeper practices such as meditation, pranayama, concentration, and the like. His background includes 7 years of studying yoga in India, as well as intensive training in the Iyengar and Anusara traditions. He's written books. How many books now, Doug?
Basically four, two on therapy, one on philosophy, one on breath.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Lots of books. He's a regular columnist with Yoga International magazine. He travels extensively, offering yoga workshops both in the US and throughout the world. So, welcome, Doug.
Thank you.
I just mentioned that you do a lot of traveling, and I know you've been doing a lot of traveling lately. So I'm just going to be a human being for a minute. When I hear about someone doing a lot of traveling, or I think of doing extensive travel myself, my thoughts go immediately to my cranky hips and sitting in a seat in an airline and gimping off an airplane. And so I'm glad we're here today. We're going to talk about hips, and perhaps you can help me with some strategies for keeping my hips healthy, as well as everyone else who's listening. I think in yoga, we do endeavor to foster healthy hip joints. But the emphasis to me, what I always hear is talk about hip openers. And I'm not quite sure what you're opening when you're opening a hip. But no one ever talks about hip closures. So I wonder, as we begin to speak, you can address people like me who live in a body with cranky hips and want to keep our joints mobile. If you can just talk a little bit about kind of fluid, comfortable hip function and how we might be thinking about using yoga to make that a lifelong practice.
Yeah, actually what keeps the hips healthy, and of course it's really important because hips are key to standing, sitting, and just about everything else that we do. But what keeps them healthy is keeping them moving. And the cartilage of the hips depends upon what's called intermittent compression, where when you're walking, you put pressure on the cartilage, it squeezes out the synovial fluid, and then when you take the pressure off of the leg, as you swing the leg forward, it releases the cartilage and it soaks the fluid back in. So that's actually what hydrates and keeps the cartilage healthy. So walking is a good exercise for the health of the hips. It's also not enough because you're only working in a certain range of motion. And so other parts of the cartilage in the hips get neglected. And hip openers address that in yoga because you're starting to go towards flexing the hips, abducting them, taking them out to the sides, and externally rotating. So that has a beneficial effect upon the cartilage on the other parts of the hips. And so it's not really about how much of a range of motion that you have in your hips, because we all have different structure to our bones. And what one person can do easily is what we think of as a hip opener is relatively impossible for another person because the joint just isn't constructed that way. So a person with limited range of motion doesn't have to worry about being not as open as the other person in class. It's really not about how far you take your hips, but rather what you're doing for the cartilage. And yeah, there is a lot of emphasis upon openers as abduction, external rotation, and also flexion. It's basically what my hips are doing right now when I'm sitting cross-legged, whether it's Sukhasana or the lotus pose or anything else like that. What also needs to be addressed and is not addressed enough is some degree of internal rotation, because we spend all our time in hip openers turning the leg in one direction, but we don't necessarily do enough internal rotation or adduction poses where we do that are things like Ardha Matsyendrasana and the twists, and that starts to get to the inner part of the hip. And one physiotherapist I was noticing recently said that people that tend to be limited in adduction and internal rotation often develop degenerative conditions in the hips or arthritis. And paradoxically, that often comes from people's structure. When somebody has more, in Europe, they call it X legs instead of knock knees. It's a nicer term than knock knees. So when your thighs angle inwards and then the shins angle outwards, that's knock knees. Some people have Y legs where the thighs angle in because of a wide pelvis, and then the shins are vertical. That actually puts a lot of compression on the inner part of the hip while it neglects the health of the cartilage of the outer part of the hip. And at the same time, that action of internal rotation and adduction is limited because it's already pinched and squeezed, and the bone needs to shift back to being centered in the joint. So we actually need to go back and forth between external and internal rotation, as well as flexion and extension. Flexion being a forward bend, extension being a back bending kind of action. All of these actions need to be done in a balanced way to get the femur to center into the socket so it moves freely from the center. A lot of our limitations in movement come from the fact that the femur shifts to a position in the socket, such as if you stand up with your hips shifted forward and kind of slumped with your tailbone tucked under. It pushes the thigh bone forward in the joint up against the edge of the joint, and that actually limits the possibility for moving in other planes. We need to get the bone to shift back into place first, and then you find you get more range of motion. So doing all of these different ranges of motion with the hips without worrying about how far you go is just a centering practice that also keeps the cartilage healthy, and you find it does increase the range of motion. But the main point of hip openers is to keep the cartilage healthy and also to keep the ligaments around the joint mobile so that the hip can move. But we don't have to go to extremes, because often when people go to extremes in hip opening or back bending, they start to overstretch the ligaments and change the position of the thigh bone, and it actually makes the hip joint less stable instead of more stable. So we're looking for a balance of mobility plus stability. That makes for a healthy hip, essentially.
We're talking, it occurred to me, because we're talking a lot at Yoga U, and you do as well, about longevity, about what I like to call inhabiting your body for the entirety of your life. Like, really,
Yeah.
naturally, if we're looking at kind of untethered aging, people who aren't doing anything, the tendency is toward becoming more and more sedentary. Partly you're not a householder in the sense of running around or anything, but without conscious addressing of that issue, you become more sedentary as you get older. And it seems like that would lend itself to what you were talking about, which is a much more limited diet of hip movement.
Yeah, a certain aspect of the cartilage in the hip starts to get worn down, the ligaments get stressed, and so you've got degeneration in one aspect, and then not so much degeneration in the other parts of the cartilage, but they're not nourished enough. And so, I mean, our cartilage doesn't have its own circulatory system like blood. It depends upon the synovial fluid to take out waste products from the tissues and restore nutrients to the tissues so it can maintain its health. And that only happens by that sort of squeeze and soak action of alternately putting some pressure on the cartilage and releasing it. And that's, again, with the example of the hips, what we do in hip openings does create a certain amount of compression and release in the hip. So that just nourishes the cartilage. If you don't do that, then the immune system can start to kick in, especially if there are other things going on in your body. It leads to inflammatory conditions. And arthritis is an inflammatory condition. And then that sets off a vicious cycle that just leads to further degeneration of the hips, because inflammation reduces mobility As you reduce mobility, it further increases the inflammation, and you get caught in this vicious cycle. And the way out of it is to move, and not to worry about how much you move, but gradually increase the range of movement without forcing it, without stressing the tissues. And then that's keeping the tissues literally juicy and healthy in that way. And it affects us on a lot of different levels, because if you have inflammation in joints because of lack of movement, then that inflammation can spread through the body in other ways and affect you. It doesn't stay localized. Even in Ayurveda, they talk about how an imbalance in the doshas spills over into other parts of the body and leads to inflammation in other parts. And I've been reading recently about how much simple movement helps us to maintain a body map, a sense of the position of the body in space, and this is beneficial to the brain. The more you reduce movement of the body, the less sense you have of your body, and that actually in many ways starts to deteriorate brain health and the healthy maintenance of the brain itself, which is a topic like is way too big to go into
Yeah.
at the moment, but it even influences because we don't have a sense of our own body. It deteriorates or it lessens the function of the mirror neurons in the brain, which means we have a less of a sense of other people too. To make a long story short, in the end, it tends to reduce our empathy towards others as we lose a sense of our own self. We can't mirror their emotions in our own understanding. And so it leads to a lot of problems that can turn into emotional issues or sort of emotional withdrawal too. So movement is really essential to our health on many, many different levels, as well as including brain health and emotional health. I find it constantly paradoxical that as much as Patanjali had a really good psychology for understanding how the mind works in yoga, his prescription for it is contrary to how we're coming to understand health for the mind and emotional health. He was basically saying, if you're suffering, reduce movement, reduce involvement in the world, and that's how you free yourself from suffering, by disassociating from it. And I mean, this is kind of playing out in real time as people's movement gets reduced with age. We're finding it doesn't really lead to mental health or emotional health. Getting up and moving actually supports your freedom from suffering, whereas promoting simply stillness or lack of movement can actually increase suffering in a lot of different ways. And so we got the psychology right, but it was the hatha yogis that came along later and said, no, for spiritual health, you actually need to move. You can't disassociate from movement. So this works on many, many different levels, all of which yoga touches upon.
I think one important thing is that you're using the word movement and you're not using the word technique or form or exercise or any of that, because really it is movement that is the lubricating factor, right? It's not a specific movement. It's not perfect movement. And I think that becomes much more important if you're dealing with aging populations where you're talking about longevity of the hips for life. You're not saying hold pigeon pose for 5 minutes. You're saying,
Exactly.
and you don't have to go on the floor. And yoga has plenty of ways to move your hips that don't involve, externally rotating and putting all your weight on your front knee.
Exactly. If you set a standard from the start and say you should be doing this or you should be doing that, they look at that and they say, "Oh, I can't do that. That's not for me. I can't manage that." And then there's no result coming from it. And so yoga tends to, or yoga as it's taught in the modern age, does tend to focus a lot upon muscles, flexibility, strength, core movement, all of those things, when really the center of the yoga practice is the health of the joints first, because if the joints are not moving properly, then you make much less progress as far as achieving flexibility or tone or strengthen the muscles. Muscles move bones, muscles move joints. If the joints don't move, what is a poor muscle to do? You end up with atrophy of the muscles because you haven't addressed the mobility of the joints yet. So some degree of mobility is necessary if you're to make progress with anything else. There is a logic to yoga practice. And so, yes, initially, it's like any kind of movement is great. And I remember somebody asked Moshe Feldenkrais, you know, essentially, what's the problems with people's joints in the body? Are they not moving enough? And he said, it's not really a lack of movement, it's a lack of variety of movement, which gets back to the point I made earlier. I mean, walking is a very healthy thing to do for your hips, but it's not necessarily enough because there's not enough variety in those actions. And even different forms of exercise like running are incredibly beneficial in a lot of ways, but at the same time, there's not a lot of variety in what you're doing with the hips. So it's like that kind of activity plus would be beneficial. And there is a logic to the movement of the joints because the muscles surrounding the joints help to maintain that space of the joint or alignment of the bone within the joint. And yoga asanas do follow a logic that's kind of described by Tom Meyer's anatomy trains, where he lays out the different fascial lines or connections between muscles that govern the movement of the body. And so muscles are not just connected to bones, they're connected to each other to produce movement. And so your calves and your hamstrings and your back muscles all work together to help you walk. It's not like individual muscles have individual jobs. And so there's a logic to how our body functions. And there's also patterns by which we get tight in different areas. You can get weak in the lower back from slumping. You can get overly tight from arching the back too much. And that affects the tone of the other lines. And then in turn affects the health of the joints. Like I said, if you slump and tuck your pelvis, it tends to misalign your hip joints. And so if we look at the structure of yoga asanas, it's working with those lines in coordination with each other to create better centering and movement of the bones and the joints, which facilitates whole body movement and whole body flexibility. You don't have to know all of these myofascial lines to really experience the benefit of the pose. But by the same token, I started by saying any kind of movement is good. And at the same time, when you really get into yoga in particular, you start to see there's a deep kind of logic and genius to how they're asking, excuse me, how they're asking the body to specifically move. And of course, yoga poses do get into extremes. Doing, pigeon pose is a back bend that most people can't really manage. They look at that and they say, well, is that the goal of what we're doing? And I feel like the basic yoga poses that you learn in an all levels or level 2 yoga class provide the larger amount of the benefits of yoga to the average person's body. And when you get into what they call more advanced yoga, where you start to play at the edges of possibility in the body, the benefits for the body have diminishing returns at that point, though there can be things about that kind of practice that are exhilarating to you and inspiring and keep you nourished by doing that practice. But it's not like everybody has to aspire to that to actually benefit from a yoga practice. A basic practice is enough. So my main point is there is a clear logic to how you move the joints in yoga poses without going to extremes, and that maximizes the benefit of the action, starting with the benefit for the joints, and from that extending into the tone of the muscles that work the body, and in turn, that facilitates or supports the proper function of the organs of the body. So you have organic health in your digestive system, your heart, your breath as well. So it all kind of fits together, but it doesn't have to be what we think of as an advanced practice to benefit from it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. What it's bringing to me is the concept of adding some kind of an element of somatic movement into perhaps an already existing practice, or adding a few minutes of dancing like nobody's watching to get really unpredictable movement and move the full spectrum. It's also making me wonder about people who practice the same sequence every day, that it sounds like that's can have a benefit that emotionally or spiritually feeds you, but it's not giving you the variety of movement you'd want to have over the long haul.
Yeah, I agree on that because there's something, comforting and almost incantational about doing a regular practice where you just kind of get into the groove and it's become so natural to you to follow that sequence that the mind doesn't have to be as actively involved in every detail, and you can get into this sort of, space, sort of like the runner's high as far as doing the practice. And there's a certain spiritual experience of doing that, but at the same time, it's not necessarily tending to all of the body's needs because you get stuck in this rut of always doing the same poses in the same sequence and the same way. And I rarely practice like that. I tend to follow a basic sort of sequence that students can follow in class, but always throwing variety into it and just a different way of doing it, a different perspective, linking poses together differently without doing it in a way that stresses the joints. And that's healthy for the joints and the muscles, but also healthy for the mind, because it opens you to the variety of experience that's possible in the body and keeps the mind refreshed and nourished too. It really promotes neuroplasticity, which means the ability of the mind to grow by making new connections, new relationships, opening to new possibilities. And that supports the health of the brain. It supports healthy memory, and it even neuroplasticity produces substances that create a good feeling through serotonin and other neurotransmitters. So that sense of variety keeps the practice fresh for you in a way that doesn't always come from following just the same sequence over and over.
Yeah. So by there, you talked about some physiological ramifications of healthy hips or unhealthy hips. By their location in the lumbopelvic hip complex, with the center of mass right there and the center of all locomotive movement, they're also, to me, kind of the linchpin of all the workhorse joints in the body. Can you talk about the hips relative to healthy hip function relative to the faraway places where we might not connect, that the problem with your shoulder is the opposite hip?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, because the basic principle of the form of the body is called tensegrity, which means tensional integrity. And you see these sculptures, these tensegrity sculptures, where it's a bunch of sticks that are held together by strings, and the tone of the strings creates the shape of the sculpture. And that makes a flexible sculpture. You can press it and it returns back to its shape in different ways. And the whole shape, form, and integrity of the sculpture depends upon the tension and tone of the strings and not upon the sticks themselves. And the body is like that too. The bones are the sticks, but the myofascial lines, the muscles, are the strings that create that shape. And it's sort of like a sweater. If you pull one thread on a sweater, it starts to change the whole shape of the sweater and distort it. In the same way, if one of the muscles is a little bit too tight or too loose, it affects the integrity of the whole structure. And if you habitually stand or sit with your hips out of alignment with the center of gravity for the rest of the body through the feet and to the crown of the head, that creates a sort of tensional pull through the whole tensegrity structure, such that, just like you're saying, having your hips a little bit shifted and twisted is going to start to give you a neck problem. What's happening in the hip here can give you neck pain there, or perhaps a little tension here, or problem in your knee. It really zigzags throughout the whole body, causing pain problems. I think of asana not in terms of just alignment of the bones to create a certain shape. And asana is a tensegrity structure where you're setting up these different shapes and form, from triangle to warrior to seated poses, really working with the tensegrity structure from different angles to create harmony between all the parts. So to me, the difference between a stretch and an asana is a stretch focuses on one particular muscle or set of muscles to create more flexibility in that area, such as the hamstrings, whereas an asana is a full body experience where a perhaps the hamstrings are involved, but it's all connected to everything else. When you're doing triangle pose and your hamstrings are tight, what effect does that have upon your shoulder or your neck? Can you organize the pose in such a way that you not only start to achieve more flexibility in the hamstring, but it gets your shoulder to open better and you experience less pain in the shoulder? And getting back to something you were saying earlier, about just dancing like nobody else is watching and all those other possibilities of unexpected movements, we do get stuck in a rut of alignment in yoga sometimes, particularly in the sense that yoga postures do tend to be a little bit more linear. They work in planes and angles and to some degree rotations or twists, but there's not a lot of circular movement for the joints. And the two main joints are the shoulders and the hips, which are ball and socket joints, which allow for a lot of rotation. But if your poses are always this and that, you're just working in certain planes. And that applies to the hips too. And I think one of the advantages of a Tai Chi practice is the movement of the joints are much more circular. Tai Chi practice is very round, whereas yoga asanas are often very linear and planar. So I often try to bring into the practice a little bit more of circular play in the joints. So for instance, in a warrior pose, instead of just putting your foot on the floor and bending the knee and trying to get your knee to line up with your foot and your hip, lift the heel and kind of play with the thigh a little bit, get it to move around and rotate in the joint. So you get a sense of that sort of freedom or joint play in the joint itself. That allows the bone to settle into a better place in the socket that allows the muscles to be more flexible. At the same time, it promotes the health of the joints. You can kind of, I do mix modalities a little bit between sort of Tai Chi sort of actions with yoga actions, just for the sake of the joints. And again, as I was saying at the beginning, if you take care of the joints, your work with the muscles is going to be a heck of a lot easier. Plus, you're going to start to relieve or reduce pain problems because you're increasing the overall tensegrity of the body. And that reduces the stress in specific locations of the body that otherwise give you pain in the muscles and also problems of inflammation in the joints. So all the parts really fit together if you think of it in that way.
Yeah, I think you've really touched on it, but for all the wonderful things yoga provides, and clearly you've enumerated lots of them, there are a lot of even senior level yogis who are currently having hip replacements. What are we doing wrong? You've kind of touched on it, but if you were to just go, stop doing this, stop, what would you say to someone who you're looking at them and you're going, this is a hip replacement waiting to happen?
First, from my experience going way back, and I started more than 20 years ago when I was meeting the real, the really hardcore yogis who studied intensively with great teachers like Iyengar and Patabi Joyce and others. And sometimes I had the feeling that the problem is too much yoga. I mean, they would do the practice for so long and so intensely, really working the joints, again, working towards extremes, which was kind of how an advanced practice was conceived at the time in a very rigorous fashion. It's funny, in original Hatha Yoga texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, the text includes mostly warnings against overdoing. And I love a part at the beginning of the Hatha Yoga Pradipika where it talks about the obstacles to your yoga. Patanjali talked about things like ignorance and laziness and things like that. And the Hatha Yoga Pradipika has one of the obstacles to yoga as being too much effort or trying too hard or basically too much yoga. And so it's possible that joints deteriorated by doing these extreme postures and doing them too much over an extended period of time. And it's possible that features of it might have been holding the poses too statically, especially going into extreme flexion, extreme extension, extreme rotation, and holding that for a long period of time, that possibly maybe weakened up the ligaments in a way that destabilized the joint and led to more deterioration over time. I mean, I can't really speak for the yogis that are having hip replacements or that kind of deterioration because there are so many other factors that come into it too, including heredity and body structure and all of these things. So you can't really make a blanket statement, but it's worth, because I do encounter students that just feel like, well, I can't do enough yoga, so why should I do yoga? Or how much yoga do I need to do? And we need to look at how much yoga is enough to keep us healthy and happy and to support everything else that we do, including the other aspects of yoga, like breath work, like calming the mind through focus and meditation. I also noticed there was a pattern going way back, like when Mr. Iyengar would teach asana and pranayama, he said you really have to master asana before you can really do pranayama because there's so much energy in pranayama. And the end result was nobody ever got around to doing pranayama because they were trying so hard to master the asana in the way that he was describing, when actually there's enough asana to support a pranayama practice without having to spend 10 years perfecting your asana before you consider pranayama. You can put all the points together and all of the practice together and find out how much is enough for you. And whatever supports your well-being and allows you to gradually progress, that's actually enough. I noticed people in the past were in a little bit too much of a hurry in their practice. So I was at a studio that had level 1 classes, level 2, level 3, level 4, and people were always asking, well, when can I progress to the next level? When can I go to the next class? People don't do that so much anymore, and I think that's a good thing, because back then people were in a hurry to progress to the next class and the next level of challenge, and that can contribute to some of the problems of overdoing that arise in a yoga practice. And I think people are more focused on their well-being now and a little bit less about advancement in their practice, often because they have so much else going on in their lives.
I think that's so true. I grew up, my yoga life was all in New York City until I had just a horrible accident and started over. And up until then, I thought it was about poses and I thought it was about that asana practice. And then I realized I didn't know anything about yoga. And that's when I started to learn about yoga. But and I think what happens to people is they start to get much more interested in taking care of their bodies as they get older and less hitting a pose for the sake of the pose. Because if you notice, what I will say to my students is, whether you get this pose or not, you're going to go home and your dog will still love you. It's like you're just practicing. You're
Yeah.
just in a studio doing some movement, you know. But you're going to be teaching a class on this, and you're going to be touching a lot of how we can keep our hips healthy for life. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, many of the points that are raised here are part and parcel of that course. And what I go into in more detail in the course with regard to the joints is this concept of joint play and how mobilizing the joints sets up a relationship with the nervous system such that when you experience better play or movement within the joints, muscles are allowed to be more flexible and allowed to be stronger. And so again, you make progress in your yoga by focusing on the joints first and the muscles second. So I'm going to be talking about the dynamics of that and how to approach that in a very practical way through your practice, especially for people that feel limited in the movement of their joints, particularly the hips. How do you make progress when it seems like you're too stiff to actually ever get anywhere in hip openers? It's just, we need to take a step back and approach it in a way that fits how the body actually works. I'll be looking at postural factors that affect the mobility and the health of the hips, both in terms of our structure, looking at how our structures of the body are different, and also habits and positioning. For instance, a lot of hip mobility depends upon the tilt of the pelvis, which actually starts with the tilt of the sacrum. But when people do a forward bend or a hip opener and they kind of slump and tilt the pelvis backwards to kind of tuck the tailbone, it actually changes the position of the hip joint such that it limits the mobility of the hips. So hip mobility is in important ways dependent upon the position and tilt of the pelvis, which includes being in alignment with the center of gravity. And we shift out of that center in different ways. We have habits of standing or sitting where perhaps our hips are shifted to one side or the other, or the pelvis is tilted forward or tilted backwards. We need to kind of recalibrate our own center in our normal activities of standing and walking, and that recalibration is facilitated by yoga practice. But you notice when we pay attention to that centering more, we start to experience more freedom and mobility in the hips. So the course is in two parts. The first part looks at the big picture of the hips and everything that affects the health of the hips, and it gives you a starting point for working with the joints. And then the second session of the course gets into very practical directions and ideas for working with asanas in a way that's going to increase your hip mobility and increase the health of the hips. Largely looking at people that are tighter in the hips, but also looking at the problem of hypermobility, because hypermobility that starts with hypermobility in the back or the sacrum or the pelvis can become a problem of hypermobility in the hips. And we'll be looking at what can you do to increase muscle tone around the hips in a way that supports the integrity of the hips, because degenerative conditions in the hips can often come from hypermobility and not just from stiffness or hypomobility. So the second part gets into really the nitty-gritty of working with asana in practical ways and looking at some of the other pain problems that arise from imbalances in the hips, pain problems like sciatic pain having to do with the piriformis. We'll look more specifically at the piriformis and not necessarily the whole picture of sciatica, but the piriformis as a muscle of the hip is a key player in the hip, as well as a key troublemaker in the hip.
And as usual, you have given us a practice, and in this case, you have also given a little bonus practice, have you not?
Yeah. Yeah, I did. The first practice is a guided asana practice that's relatively simple and accessible. And for people that are more experienced or have a little bit more demanding practice, I've got a second practice that gets into a little bit more challenging hip poses without going to crazy extremes. But for more experienced yogis, the second practice gives them a little bit more. And for people that are less experienced, you might want to grab a bowl of popcorn, sit back and watch. You know, not that it gets crazy, but also I give alternatives where you can try this. If you want to take it a little bit further, you can do this, emphasizing how the same actions can be taken as the logic for going deeper into poses.
Excellent. Well, I'm looking forward to the course. As usual, 20 minutes with you is like taking a course. So thank you for your generous share. And I think the course is going to be fantastic.
Great.
So, and thank all of you for your listening and for being part of our community. And we'll see you all in class. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.